railed for one reason or another. We're going to talk about all of them, and I got a handful of guys today that I think are going to absolutely explode in their second year heading into 2021. So let's dive straight into this without further ado. But before we do, so I guess this is further ado, before we do, if you like these videos, you appreciate all this content here, and you think maybe along the way we've helped you out at Awesemo Fantasy Football Channel, thumbs up, subscribe to the channel, help us get the 6K subs, and let's dive into it. Henry Ruggs may not have been a player you expected to see on this list, but I think there are more than just a couple of reasons to be excited about him going into year two. Ruggs is being drafted as the wide receiver 56 on Underdog Fantasy, which means we're hardly committing much draft capital to begin with. But it's what he can bring to the table as a sophomore receiver that gets my attention. Ruggs put on 13 pounds in the offseason, which he doesn't believe will affect his speed. He said it was mostly to improve as a blocker, but I don't think putting on some LBs is going to hurt him becoming a more physical receiver in contested balls. He already created good enough separation as a rookie, led all first-year receivers in yards per reception, and should absolutely be used a lot more in 2021. Look at it this way. The Raiders drafted Ruggs 12th overall, ahead of Jerry Jeudy, CeeDee Lamb, and Justin Jefferson. Crazy, I know. But still, as the first receiver off the board just 1 year back, it would be an egregious misuse of first-round draft capital to not expand his role significantly in year two, even though the Raiders have been known to egregiously misuse draft capital in the first round. And the Raiders' offense isn't bad either. They finished top 10 in scoring last year, while Darren Waller posted the 7th most PPR points of any pass catcher, and the since-departed Nelson Agholor enjoyed his best season as a pro, with 896 yards and 8 touchdowns on 48 receptions. Derek Carr was solid too, with a top 10 adjusted completion percentage and the 6th highest yards per attempt. Still, Ruggs will have to put the pieces together on his own, and hopefully his insane speed and athleticism will be more than enough to get him involved not just as a deep threat, only 3 quarterbacks created more yards on deep balls than Carr last year, by the way, but also as a receiver who can create big yards after the catch on opportunities closer to the line of scrimmage. And John Gruden has already said he wants to get Ruggs involved as a lot more than just a deep threat this season. Ultimately, we're spending a double-digit round pick on the first receiver off the board in 2020. His disappointing 10% target share and 43 targets as a rookie can only improve dramatically this season, and we could see him as the number 2 option behind Waller and ahead of John Brown. What if I told you T. Higgins was 12th in targets in the 9 games he played with Joe Burrow under center last year? Or that he was the wide receiver 20 over that stretch? Yeah, Higgins was crushing his rookie season and was on a 16-game pace of 80 receptions, 1,206 yards, and 8 touchdowns before Burrow went down in Week 11 and was replaced by the likes of Brandon Allen and Ryan Finley, who were both disastrous. Higgins was the wide receiver 41 in the games those guys started, and what could have been an insane rookie season ended as an impressive one but left much to be desired. Now Joe Burrow is seemingly healthy, with both him and Higgins entering their second year with some experience under their belts. And while Jamar Chase is an insane talent, we can't ignore that A.J. Green was targeted over 100 times last season and is out of Cincinnati. Actually, Higgins, Green, and Tyler Boyd were pacing season target totals of 117, 124, and 144 respectively before Burrow went down. Burrow is a talented young quarterback who can support more than one strong wide receiver season, as evidenced by last year, and will likely have to throw a lot again this year, with Cincinnati's defense likely being mediocre at best. Burrow averaged more than 40 pass attempts per game through the first 11 weeks, where all 3 of his starting receivers were top 20 in targets, while Higgins earned a target share north of 20%, so you get the point. Oh, and did I mention no receiver saw more deep ball targets than Higgins with Burrow under center, even though he only caught 6 of those 22 looks. There's a ton of room for improvement there, though, even if Jamar Chase has an impressive rookie campaign. Higgins has a 45 ADP on Underdog as the 22nd receiver off the board, and honestly, I'm okay with it. But you can no doubt get him a lot later on other sites where Chase is going a lot earlier than Higgins.
Sure thing. It is the Awesemo MLB Strategy Show, also a little bit of MLB early live before lock, and a whole bunch of baseball games to talk about because we have the Red Sox and the Blue Jays playing a doubleheader. That's included on both the main slate and the early slate on DraftKings. So a total of 16 games to break down. Not a lot of room for dilly-dallying at the top, but Adam, how are you doing today?
Doing pretty good. I always like when we have two baseball slates. Saturdays are really fun because you get that, plus you get MMA. So really, really excited, and didn't think I was going to be playing DFS today, but then I bailed on my friends, so now I get to play. So that's always good.
Hey, listen, nothing like improving your day, upgrading a little bit, and doing the real thing by bailing on your friends and just sitting at home and playing DFS. You know, it's funny because last year there was a point in time where we couldn't really go anywhere, do anything. And now that we kind of can, it's like, I don't want to do anything anyway. But hey, that aside, we've got two baseball slates to talk about today. Lots of time to sit on our ass, sit at home, play MLB DFS. First game we have here on the slate, the Mariners against the Yankees. A pretty high run total in this game, 10 overall. Chris Flexen going up against Andrew Heaney. Now, his last time out, Andrew Heaney, in his debut with the Yankees, was a massive chalk pitcher. He was something like 50% owned in tournaments that day. People have taken a little bit of a step back on him today, although it's a smaller slate. He's actually probably in a more favorable spot today against the Seattle Mariners. But second Andrew Heaney start with the Yankees. What are you expecting from him relative to his first start?
The exact same thing as every other time Andrew Heaney pitches. He's going to strike out a bunch of dudes. He's going to leave some balls in the middle of the plate. If the Mariners make contact, they're going to go really far. Like, that's just what Andrew Heaney starts are. He's overall a good pitcher. He doesn't walk a lot of guys. He strikes out a bunch of guys, good xFIP, all of that. He just makes like 3 give or take mistakes a game where his stuff just sits in the middle of the plate and gets absolutely smashed. If those balls happen to be fouled straight back or be caught on the warning track, he has a really good start. If those balls are squared up, then he has a mediocre start. That's just really what Andrew Heaney is.
Yeah, and that's also why the last time he was out, it's like there's always reason to see GPP upside at him. And in terms of real life, he's not particularly good. He has a 5.42 ERA, a 4.4 expected ERA. It's just for fantasy purposes, he's a 28% K rate. So every Andrew Heaney start, this is how I feel about it. I want to be on him. I want to stack against him. There's no way around it. There's upside on both sides. He's either going to score, 25 to 30 DraftKings points or something like that, or he's just going to give up a bunch of home runs and hard hits, and the Mariners are going to make for a good stack. So on the other side, we have the Mariners as a stack that's not picking up quite enough ownership today. Same as last time when Heaney pitched. We were both on the Orioles. We liked them as a contrarian stack. This is a smaller slate, so I wouldn't necessarily call the Mariners, massively contrarian, but I think it's a high upside spot that is getting a little bit overlooked.
Yeah, high upside spot. Still getting a little bit less ownership than they deserve, and Heaney's still picking up like 35% ownership, so you're getting leverage against him. The other thing with Heaney, and this, also relates back to going to the Mariners, but when Andrew Heaney was like 7,400, 7,500, it was one thing because he can give up a couple of home runs or give up 3 runs. He's going to strike out enough guys that he can give you a serviceable score even in that kind of game at that salary. And then, the games where he doesn't give up a run, he's still going to put up a really good score. At 8,900, there's not a lot of wiggle room for a guy that gives up a lot of home runs. Like, you actually need those good Andrew Heaney starts at that salary. So it does, I think, make it even more difficult to like him. And alternatively, it makes it even easier to like Seattle because, if Andrew Heaney were 7,400 here on this slate, it would still be like, man, every time I stack Seattle, it means I'm not rostering the clear number one guy at 7,400. At 8,900, I don't really care that much about the lineups. I don't have Andrew Heaney. I'm fine getting to Seattle even more.
Yeah, and I mean, we have seen Heaney struggle in some overall pretty favorable matchups on paper. His recent starts were against Baltimore, against Colorado, also a start against Seattle. He made a start in Minnesota when the Twins were kind of a weaker offense already at that point. So he's made a handful of starts against weaker teams in a row, and it's the same guy. He gave 4 home runs against the Orioles last time out. He gives up a lot of hard contact. So this is a spot where, especially for a smaller slate, I think we want to be playing both sides. On the other side of the game, we have Chris Flexen starting for Seattle. We've seen Flexen put up some, okay starts as of late. Nothing that's been groundbreaking or anything like that. He's not a high strikeout guy. But this matchup against the Yankees is absolutely brutal. This Yankees offense now with Joey Gallo and Anthony Rizzo, I fully expect to be one of the, if not the best offense in baseball for the rest of the season. But they're going to be super popular today for the early slate. So what are you doing with the ownership on them?
Yeah, I assume I'll end up under the field on the Yankees, especially in terms of full stacks. I'm still mixing these guys in because they do have a lot of power, and you can still win tournaments by, having just getting 1 or 2 home runs. The Yankees as a stack fail, but they hit a couple home runs and you get those guys. So I like mixing them in. Flexen has done a good job this year of limiting power. He doesn't get strikeouts. And against a team like the Yankees, that is very, very concerning because we've talked about it before. Whenever you just have guys that are high strikeout, high power guys, and then you're putting them up against a pitcher that is going to let them hit the ball. It's a really, really dangerous situation. His batted ball numbers this year, as far as ground balls and fly balls go, decent ground ball percentage, but nothing crazy. 45.2% ground ball percentage. So it's not like when we talked about Framber Valdez the other day, and it was like, yeah, he's going to let them hit the ball, but he also has a 71% ground ball percentage. So who really cares? Flexen is giving up enough fly balls that if you're going to let the Yankees hit those in Yankee Stadium, they're probably going to have success. So I think they're going a little bit over-owned. I don't think it's the worst, or it's not the best spot in the world because Flexen has done a pretty good job at limiting power, but overall, I think clearly advantage Yankees.
Yeah, this is the team that, at least on paper, should be the highest scoring team of the slate. But obviously, baseball DFS doesn't necessarily always work out that way. According to our top stacks tool and the information there, it's also a team I'd be underweight to the field on. It's very rare. And I'm sure people have picked up on this point, but both me and you at this point of the baseball season, whenever there's a team that's projected to be like 26, 27% owned as a whole, as a stack, it's very rare that you and I are going to be with or overweight to the field in that situation. So Yankees, I still think they're worth mixing into lineups, but I'm going to be pretty heavily underweight to the field given what the current ownership is projected for. Next game we have here, it is the north side versus south side, Chicago White Sox versus the Chicago Cubs. And one of the most important pieces of this entire slate, Carlos Rodon, is projected for 70% ownership on DraftKings. On FanDuel, he's projected for right around 60% ownership. A whole lot of ownership going to Rodon. I understand why. He's by far the best pitcher on this slate. But what are you doing with him in terms of how much exposure you want relative to the field?
Yeah, it's tough because, it is only a 5-game slate. The Cubs are really bad. If he actually is going to pull 70% ownership, then I think I'm fine giving some of that to Robbie Ray, giving some of that to just anyone else, really. But he is the best pitcher on the slate. He does have a good matchup against the Cubs. Looks like the wind may be blowing out a little bit in Wrigley, but doesn't look like it's enough to really matter. Just, a really, really bad Cubs lineup. And Rodon's been one of the best pitchers in baseball this year. So I think, there's nothing really negative to say about him or the spot. It's just a matter of how big is the tournament you're playing and how much does that ownership matter.
And then in terms of getting leverage off of them, at what point would you be willing to start to make leverage stacks against Rodon? Like, how many lineups would you have to be playing where you start to say, like, okay, I'm going to mix in one Cub stack here or there?
Probably, I think if I played 20, I could see having like a Cubs stack. In 150, I'd probably get, more than one. Right now, we have them projected for like 3.5% aggregate ownership. I would think I get around the field, maybe a little bit higher as you move towards the massive field tournaments. It's still a low probability spot. It's a bad offense. And the thing is, it would be one thing, we have the Cubs with a 3.4% chance of being a top stack. It would be one thing if they were projected for like 1% ownership. But the thing that you do see when in a situation like this, where like Carlos Rodon is clearly the pitcher everyone's going to roster, people do just kind of blindly stack the other team enough to where it's just like, oh, the Cubs are going to be 1% owned. And it's like, no, they're 4 or 5, which kind of sucks because, even if they do go off, you're still competing with a reasonably large number of people. So it right now, at least, still doesn't look like a spot that I would get to a lot of. I think I probably, at least the way my lineups have been going lately, it seems like I've been paying up for pitching a little bit more. I think that's a function of there just being a lot of cheap bats. Hitter pricing hasn't been that great. So I think right now, the way it looks, I probably end up, if anything, overweight on Rodon, and then just, not really getting to the Cubs. But certainly, things can change between now and lock.
It's funny because one of the main reasons that we've been able to pay up for pitching so much is because there have been really cheap bats on the Cubs, and the Nationals have been the other one where it's just every day for the last, whatever it is, week or so since the trade deadline, these teams have had lineups where they're just a bunch of min-price hitters because the Cubs lineup sucks, the Nationals lineup sucks. So yeah, there have been a lot of spots to roster min-price hitters. So I'm with you. I've also been paying up for pitching, which I generally pay up for pitching in baseball, but it was something I did a little bit less towards the middle of the season when there was so much uncertainty with a lot of pitchers, especially high-end guys. But I have gotten back to it a little more recently just because of, like you said, there's been so many cheaper hitters to mix into lineups. But on the other side of this game, we're going to have Adbert Alzolay starting for the Cubs. There's a little bit of strikeout upside in Alzolay. He does have a 24.3% K rate. He's reasonably cheap in both FanDuel and DraftKings. One concern here is just the results haven't been very good from a run allowance perspective. 4.85 ERA, 4.84 expected ERA. For salary savings, I could see going to Adbert Alzolay, but I think the bigger talking point here is going to be the Chicago White Sox are massively popular and appear to be getting way more ownership than is warranted in our projections.
Yeah, I mean, this is one team that does have a lot of value on it. Anderson and Abreu are expensive, but outside of that, you have Jimenez and Moncada both at 4,600. Everyone else is 3,800 or less in their projected starting lineup. I think that it's a really interesting spot because Adbert Alzolay has had massive splits this year. He's been just absolutely lights out against right-handed hitters, 28.8% strikeout percentage, 130 expected ISO allowed. The issue has been lefties have only struck out 19.5% of the time, and he's allowed a 305 expected ISO. If you go back to last year, you can add a couple hundred more pitches to each side of the plate, and you get a similar thing: 123 expected ISO to righties, 262 to lefties. The problem is that the White Sox are probably going to have a lot of cheap left-handed bats here. Cesar Hernandez is a switch hitter. Gavin Sheets left-handed. Moncada is a switch hitter. Goodwin and Collins are both left-handed. Like, the only good thing for Alzolay, I guess, is that 3 of the most dangerous hitters and 3 of the top 4 are going to be right-handed with Anderson, Abreu, and Jimenez. So that helps out a little bit. But overall, you are getting 5 left-handed bats here. He does also get to face the pitcher. So I think it's just a really high, like, boom or bust spot, because we know this White Sox team will strike out. We know, again, that Alzolay's had really good numbers against righties, and those are the most dangerous hitters in this lineup for the White Sox, and the White Sox are getting a lot of ownership. So I have some interest in Alzolay at 6,700. He is getting 15% ownership. I do think that the White Sox overall look pretty good, but like you said, they're getting massive ownership. And this is a team that, they have high upside hitters. They have guys with power, but this is a team that is also pretty inconsistent and seems to fail a lot. So it's kind of like the Yankees, except for I will be a lot more scared about not having Yankees than I will not having White Sox.
Yeah, and it's just so much ownership here. Also, in terms of ownership and leverage here, it's going to be a little different FanDuel versus DK, although the White Sox are over-owned on FanDuel as well. But on DraftKings, by the way, the top stack score that is free to use over at Awesemo.com, so you guys could check out this data and look at it for yourself. We have the White Sox with a 17.1% chance to be the top scoring team of the day. Fairly significant odds, second best on the slate, but they are projected to be the highest owned offense over on DraftKings with a 26.5% ownership share. So if you are playing them, even with the field, your odds of hitting the nut lineup, it's just way less than we have it projected. So this is a team that relative to these current odds, I'd have one-offs of them for sure because a lot of them are too cheap. And this is, like you said, it seems like the wind might be blowing out a little bit, favorable hitting conditions, but there is too much ownership for this team as an aggregate stack. So I prefer using them as one-offs and just making a whole bunch of 5-man White Sox stacks. Not that I want to have 0% of them, but given what this current data is, I probably have something like 5 to 6% White Sox stacks, which would be like a fifth of what the field has.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I'm thinking too. Like, for example, and it's more extreme, obviously, but like on last night's 3-game slate, the 3-game night slate for anyone that played that, like, Oakland was in a really, really good spot. They were also getting a ton of ownership. I ended up getting around, I think, 8 to 10% on a lot of their hitters that were like 40-50% owned. I think that's kind of what ends up happening to me with the Yankees and the White Sox here too.
Yeah, that's probably where I'll be at as well. And now the next game here, we have a doubleheader game, first part of a doubleheader game. The Blue Jays and the Red Sox, who are not going to be playing on either FanDuel slate today, but they're included on both the DraftKings slates. I hate this, and I think it's also really annoying because there's a chance that we won't know who's even starting for the Red Sox or the Blue Jays potentially for the later game until after it locks, depending on how that goes, because we've seen that happen at points in time this year. So only DK data is going to matter here, but Robbie Ray on the mound for Toronto, Nick Pivetta on the mound for Boston. First off, as far as stacks go, I rarely like to roster teams when it's 7-inning games, especially if the home team ends up winning. They only get 6 innings to at bat, and that always is going to cap people's upside. Also, the pitching matchup here, fairly decent pitchers on both sides. The offense are also both really good, but I can't really see myself stacking teams too heavily in a 7-inning game. But I think the key here is going to be Robbie Ray, who is still one of the more talented pitchers on the slate. What are you doing with him in this matchup against the Red Sox?
Yes, I mean, it's a brutal matchup for him, but he is getting right now less than half the ownership that Carlos Rodon is getting. And, it's clearly a better spot for Carlos Rodon, but 30.5% strikeout percentage for Ray. He's been good this year, 3.4 xFIP. The only real issue is he has allowed 1.66 home runs per 9. And that is obviously an issue when you're talking about facing this Red Sox lineup that just has all kinds of right-handed power. But in tournaments, I do think that moving some of that Carlos Rodon to Robbie Ray is a viable path to go. He does get a little bit higher ceiling here because of it being a 7-inning game. It's just a lot more likely he throws 7 innings than that he throws 9, and you get the complete game bonus on DraftKings. I do think that, and I agree with you about offenses in doubleheaders. I do think it's a little bit more appealing on this particular slate than it is on most, because when you look through the slate, you have so much ownership going to the Yankees and the White Sox. So we've kind of said, just from a game theory perspective, we don't like getting to a lot of that. You have a really, really tough matchup for the Cubs. So, that kind of sucks. The Mariners we like. The Rangers are terrible. The Phillies have a brutal matchup against, or at least a bad matchup against Tyler McGill. It's kind of a really, really small slate for offenses when there's I think the Red Sox and the Blue Jays are probably more likely to be the highest scoring team than the Rangers ever, or the Cubs against Carlos Rodon. So I do have a little bit more interest in the bats here than I normally do.
Yeah, I mean, I guess that's true relative to the slate. Just as a kind of general rule for me, there aren't that many spots where I'm stacking 7-inning games. But yeah, yeah, I don't really know what to make of it. I'll have to think about it more as we get closer to the lock. But Robbie Ray, talking about him as an individual pitcher, I know you touched on him and his upside there. Any concerns about a little bit of a dip in his control, at least? So one thing about Robbie Ray that was really good early in the season that really helped his success is that he'd really limited the walks. It's a little concerning to me that he has 3 walks in 6 innings in each of his last 2 starts, and then also gave 3 home runs the time before. I'm a little afraid of there being some regression coming. So just one thing I'll ask about the offense. Would you rather stack the Red Sox or the Blue Jays offense in this spot?
I think I'd rather go to the Blue Jays, just because I think Ray's a better pitcher than Pivetta. They're kind of similar in that they can strike out a lot of guys and they both give up a lot of power. I just think that the sort of average Pivetta outing is worse than the average Ray outing. You could make the case, like you were saying, at least we know the Red Sox are getting 7 at bats. The Blue Jays, if they're winning, are only getting 6. But at the same time, if they're winning, they probably scored some runs. They are favored here. We do have them with a slightly higher top stack percentage as well. So I do lean towards Toronto, but I think they're very similar just in that you're taking on a big risk because you're sacrificing 2 or 2.5 innings of hitting, but it's also just kind of like the alternatives in a lot of spots aren't very good on this slate either.
All right. The next game here, Tyler McGill is going to be on the mound in Philly against the Phillies. Ranger Suarez. The Mets have been all kinds of struggling ever since I bet them to win the division. I really put a curse on them, because then as soon as I bet the Mets to win the division, it was after the Ronald Acuna injury. Jacob deGrom then gets hurt. Then we had Francisco Lindor gets hurt, and the Mets just can't win any close games ever. Tyler McGill is going to be on the mound. I still like him as a young pitching prospect, and he's looked pretty good at times. The last time I was a little shaky against the Marlins, but for this particular spot, what do you make of McGill and his matchup against the Phillies?
I think it's a tough spot because the Phillies have a pretty solid offense. They're in Philadelphia, almost a 5 implied run total for the Phillies. The thing that I like, though, is that McGill does give you a little bit of a price discount off of the guys at the top in Rodon and Ray. And then he's also just not projected for much ownership right now. He's 8,500. Andrew Heaney's 8,900. Heaney's getting 35% on DraftKings. McGill's only getting about 10%. I don't think, I don't love the spot for McGill, but I don't think Andrew Heaney should be favored that heavily over McGill. For the season, he has struck out 25.9% of hitters. He has a good 3.86 xFIP. Walk rate is pretty solid at 6.6%. 1.12 home runs per 9 is a little elevated, but nothing too alarming. I just think that you should get more balanced ownership between Heaney and McGill. So even though I don't love the spot here against Philly, I think if let's assume that there is a combined 45% ownership going to Heaney and McGill, I think I'm more likely to be 22 and 22 than 35 and 10.
And then on the other side is going to be Ranger Suarez on the mound for the Phillies. For all intents and purposes, I think this is basically going to be a bullpen game. Ranger Suarez, I don't think is going to work very deep into the game. He's made a total of 28 appearances this year, but 27 are out of the bullpen, only 1 are a start. So first, I'll ask you, how deep do you think Ranger Suarez is going to work into the game? And then what do you think of the Mets offense against what I expect is mostly going to be a bullpen game? Yeah,
so they're stretching him out to be a starter. They replaced him in the bullpen when they got Ian Kennedy. He went 3 innings last time out through 33 pitches. I have a hard time thinking he throws more than 40, 45, maybe 50 pitches here. Regardless, just not a spot I'm looking to roster him. I think that you get probably 3 or 4 innings from him, and then you get the Phillies bullpen behind him, which is actually pretty nice for the Mets.
Yeah, and that's there are a lot of spots where it's a bullpen game. It's like this is a kind of a sneaky, tougher matchup than most people realize it to be. But the Phillies don't have a particularly good bullpen, and they also had to use a lot of their better bullpen pitchers yesterday in what was a really close game against the Mets. So, I think this is a pretty good spot for the Mets that maybe people might look at and be like, oh, it's a bullpen game, and kind of write it off a little bit. But we've got the Mets over on FanDuel. 14% chance to be a top stack of the day, 11.8% ownership share. They have a pretty positive leverage score. Over on DK, same deal, 13.6% top stack odds, 12.7% ownership share. So both sides, the Mets look a little bit under-owned. I think this is an offense that I want to be getting to.
Yeah, right there with you. And there are some spots in this lineup, at least, that are pretty cheap. Brandon Nimmo leading off at 3,700. Yes, it's a lefty-lefty matchup, but you're not expecting Suarez to go deep into the game. Michael Conforto's cheap. McCann's cheap. Almora, if he's in the lineup, his minimum salary. JD Davis has tons of power, so you like that. And then, the guys to pay up for with McNeil and Alonso and Baez. Even Alonso at 4,600 is a pretty sizable discount. So I do really like the Mets here. I think that along with Seattle, and then we haven't talked about Oakland yet, but out of the teams we've talked about and, factoring in ownership, I think the Mets and Seattle are the teams I like the most at the moment.
Well, it is time to talk about Oakland because they're playing against the Texas Rangers today, and Drew Anderson's going to be on the mound for Texas, and he does have a 0 ERA this year. He's only pitched 4 innings, though. That 0 ERA comes with a 5.38 expected ERA, but you look at his numbers for his career, and he has pitched a total of 26 big league innings, almost all of them out of the bullpen. And he has an 8.2 ERA, 4.54 expected ERA. You look at the minor league numbers for him, they're not good either. This year in AAA, he had a 4.14 FIP, 5.04 xFIP. You go back to 2019 in AAA with the Phillies, where he had a 5.77 ERA, 6.31 FIP, 6.38 xFIP. By all means, I do not think Drew Anderson looks like a quality big league pitcher. I think this is a very good spot for Oakland.
Yeah, I'm mostly with you. I think it looks like a good spot. I'm definitely going to lean towards Anderson not being good. I do think that his numbers this year at AAA kind of jump out, and it's more so like it's really hard to gauge guys like this sometimes because they essentially didn't pitch last year because they're, mostly minor league players. In 2020, he threw 1 1/3 innings. So you really have to go back to 2019 where he only at AAA, he only struck out 17.9% of hitters. Then suddenly this year at AAA, he makes 12 starts, 14 total appearances, and he has a 30.2% strikeout percentage. Something is probably different with him. Like that's a ridiculous jump in strikeout percentage to just be random. So I think he probably is better now than he was in the past. I still think that, being better at AAA when you're 27 years old doesn't necessarily translate to actually being good in the major leagues all that often. But I think there's at least a chance he's just a better pitcher than he used to be. But it's still a very dangerous Oakland lineup, and I would still clearly side with them over whatever Drew Anderson may or may not be at this point.
Yeah, and then especially also talking about FanDuel, where we don't have the doubleheader game, and there's even more ownership going to the Yankees and White Sox than there are over on DraftKings. So as a result, we have the A's and the Mets are the two most positively leveraged stack on FanDuel. They also on DK, Oakland about appropriately owned, but still, I think that any of that ownership that looks a little bit too much on the Yankees and White Sox, I think a lot of that for me is going to go to teams like the Mets and the A's, just because these are actually decent offenses that I like the spot they're in. Whereas, some of these other offenses we talked about, the Red Sox, the Blue Jays, I'm kind of concerned about it being a doubleheader game. And then the other lower owned offense, we've got the Rangers on the other side of this game. They suck. So I don't really want to roster them. The Cubs are going up against Rodon. So trying to figure out overall offense ownership. I have a feeling that the Mets and the A's, that's probably where I land to be the my most stacked offenses. But now let's talk about those Texas Rangers, because oddly enough, as bad as they are, they're kind of picking up some ownership tonight. I don't get it.
Yeah, I think it's probably because they're insanely cheap. In their projected lineup, there are 5 hitters that are $2,000 on DraftKings. And then you get Nate Lowe at $3K, Adolis Garcia at $3K, Kiner Falefa, the most expensive at $3,800. So they're just a team that, if you're going like Robbie Ray plus Carlos Rodon or Andrew Heaney, some combination of those guys. And then you go to Texas against a pretty average pitcher in Cole Irvin. It's just going to save you a bunch of money, and then you can get the good bats that you want around it. So I think that's why you see the ownership come up there. It's a spot I'll try and avoid as much as I can. I think it's an okay spot for Adolis Garcia. He does have a lot of power from the right side. You can never really go wrong with rostering $2,000 hitters. It's just really not a great practice, I don't think, when they're relatively popular because everyone else is doing the same thing. And Cole Irvin's not a terrible pitcher. He's not good, but he's, 0.73 home runs per 9, 4.6 xFIP, 17.5% strikeout percentage, only walks 4% of hitters. The game is in Oakland where it's supposed to be around 70 degrees, favors pitching. So, I think it's just a spot where in general in MLB DFS, when the slate forces the field to roster really bad hitters at relatively high ownership, you're just going to make more money over the long run by saying, yeah, okay, I think these bad hitters go 0 for 3, or maybe they get a single or something. And I can just build different teams, like different roster construction, maybe take some risks elsewhere, but get higher upside guys. I think that's just typically a good approach to take.
Yeah. Cole Irvin also, I find him to be about appropriately owned. It's really hard to avoid him on the slate at a 7,500 price tag, because the only two pitchers on DK that are in the 7,000 price range are Chris Flexen and Cole Irvin. And I certainly prefer Cole Irvin against the Rangers than I do Chris Flexen going up against the Yankees. Over on FanDuel, I don't really think we have to consider Cole Irvin because it's a single pitcher site, but Cole Irvin, about 30% ownership. I expect that's about where I'm going to be.
Yeah, I think that's about right. And like you said, it's just kind of a dead price point because it's useful because it lets you get good hitters into your lineup. But there's just nothing really there except for him and Flexen. You can make the leverage case for Flexen, but that's really the only case you can make. Irvin is just likely to outscore him because it's such a better spot. So yeah, I expect to be around the field on Cole Irvin.
All right, that is going to do it for the early slate, but now we're going to talk about the main slate. This is the night slate on FanDuel and DraftKings, and this is one that is not going to include the second half of the Blue Jays Red Sox game on FanDuel. It is included on DraftKings, so that's going to be one thing that's a little bit different about it. But one thing before we start here, the main slate guys, do us a favor, like the video, also subscribe to the YouTube channel because we have got so much stuff coming up today. If you guys just want to play DFS and just degen the whole day and say, I'm playing all the DFS sports, we've got MLB today, more MLB shows later. There's MLB Live Before Lock. We also got MMA. There's MMA Live Before Lock. I'm also going to be doing a short monkey knife fight show today with Jason Floyd in the afternoon. We also have NASCAR Strategy Show. So NASCAR, MMA, MLB, we've got everything over at Awesemo.com. So subscribe to the YouTube channel and check out all of that content. Now talking about the main slate. First game here, one of the higher run totals of the entire day. It is a 10-run total between the Tampa Bay Rays and the Baltimore Orioles. Shane McClanahan is going to be on the mound for Tampa Bay. Spencer Watkins for Baltimore. Let's start with McClanahan because he's somebody who, for fantasy purposes, I've actually liked quite a bit this year. Really good stuff, really good strikeout stuff. The one concern is just he doesn't really work all that deep into games. Yeah,
and that's a pretty big concern when you talk about someone at $8,500. A lot of it ends up coming down to ownership on someone like that. Right now, we have him projected at 10% ownership on DraftKings, which I think is very reasonable. We'd seen some slates recently where he was projected for quite a bit more. It's at that price tag, you just don't have a lot of margin for error. So when you're expecting a pitcher to be pulled, after 85 to 90 pitches, kind of regardless of what he's doing, it sort of lowers the ceiling and makes him a little bit riskier. But at the same time, when guys are pulled around there, they're really just missing like that third time through the order, which is where pitchers typically struggle and give back fantasy points anyway. So it's not the end of the world. It's just that it sort of takes that final step off the table where, he's most likely not going to have that 105 pitch 8-inning start because the Rays are just going to say, yeah, you're not doing that. We don't care how you're doing. So that's kind of off the table for someone like him, but he does have really good stuff. It's a pretty decent matchup against the Orioles. He struck out 28% of hitters for the season, 3.34 xFIP, a little bit of issue with home runs, 1.17 home runs per 9 innings. To right-handed hitters, he has a 27.9% strikeout percentage, 156 expected ISO. So I think it's overall a pretty good spot, even though, there are some dangerous hitters in the Orioles lineup. It might actually be a weaker lineup than normal today for McClanahan as well, because Ryan Mountcastle left yesterday's game early after being smacked in the head by Wander Franco on a stolen base attempt. So he may not even be in the lineup today.
All right. This Rays spot now is one that I just had to refresh ownership to make sure that's correct, because we have one of the weird ownership splits I could ever remember seeing. And I understand that there's going to be an ownership difference across FanDuel and DraftKings, but on DK today, the Rays have a 7.8% projected ownership share. That makes them the most under-owned offense in our top stack stool on the entire slate. Now over on FanDuel, they are projected for a 21.4% ownership share. So we have the Rays as the most negatively leveraged stack on the entire FanDuel slate. I can't remember ever seeing something like this. One team is the most positive leveraged stack team on one slate, most negative leveraged stack team on another slate. It's all due to pricing. The FanDuel's price them as being fairly cheap at. DK has them as really expensive, at least relative to this current ownership. I get the Rays are expensive. I like the spot though. Not enough ownership going there. I absolutely love paying up for them on DK. Yeah,
same here. Had a ton of them yesterday in a similar spot where they were the top stack and just not getting as much ownership as some of the other stacks around them because they're so expensive. Now you get an even better matchup than you had yesterday. Spencer Watkins nowhere near as good as John Means. And you also get that add-on upside, just like we saw yesterday. John Means held the Rays to like 2 or 3 runs, and then the bullpen just absolutely imploded. And up until the Rockies started up until the Rockies game started, you kind of needed Tampa Bay to have a shot in tournaments, just solely because of how bad Baltimore's bullpen is. Now you get a bad starter followed by the bad bullpen. Just massive upside for this team. A huge park upgrade getting out of Tropicana, going into Camden Yards. Spencer Watkins this year against right-handed hitters has a 9.8% strikeout percentage, 205 expected ISO compared to a 113 actual ISO. So you can see he's been getting really lucky there. Lefties, he's actually struck out 25%, 141 expected ISO versus 122 actual. But there's just nothing about this guy that makes me think he's actually going to be good long-term. I think you see lefties start to have success against him as well, especially ones that are as good as Brandon Lau and Austin Meadows and the guys that are in this lineup for Tampa Bay. So absolutely love Tampa here. The only guys really getting ownership are Nelson Cruz, which, obviously he's a great play. Regardless, 16% ownership on him doesn't really matter. Mike Zunino, $4,500 catcher option, getting some ownership because he's a catcher. Brandon Lau is next at 9%, and then everyone else is 6.5% or lower. So if you full stack this team, you're just going to get some low owned guys and be in a really, really good spot.
Yeah, and then also the one other thing I'll say is totally different FanDuel versus DraftKings. Is DraftKings, I think the Rays are my highest priority stack on the slate. And FanDuel, I don't want anything to do with them at 22% projected ownership. So it's crazy. I can't ever remember there being a slate where there's been that big of an ownership gap across the two different sites. But that also goes to show how much pricing impacts ownership and also how much it's going to impact who people play. So Rays, really strong stack on DK, less so on FanDuel. Next game we have here to talk about, it is the other half of the doubleheader between the Red Sox and the Toronto Blue Jays. Jose Barrios expected to pitch for Toronto, Tanner Houck on the mound for Boston. Now, one thing I'm going to say about this game, first, in terms of stacks, I'm not going to have interest, but as far as pitchers go, there could be a chance that because this is a doubleheader, there could be really weak lineups that are thrown out for the second half of the doubleheader, which could make this much more favorable spots for the pitchers than it would normally be going up against Boston or Toronto. So keep an eye on that. But other than that, offenses here, what are you doing with them? And then the pitchers, what do you make of them?
Sorry, I was answering something in chat, but Boston game, right?
Yeah. So Boston game, I was just the point I was making is that with this being the second part of a doubleheader, we'll often see the lineups being really weak. And there's a chance we see some core players rested that normally wouldn't be. So with all that in mind, I don't really like stacking this game also because it's just a 7-inning game, but I also think this could make for a sneaky spot to target the pitchers.
Yeah, I agree with that. So this, with it being a 11 game slate or 10, well, I guess it doesn't matter on FanDuel. With this being an 11 game slate on DraftKings, what we were talking about on the early slate does apply. Like, I have no interest in going to these offenses. Plus, it's two pretty good pitchers going. But yeah, you could get some sneaky upside because not only do you get the increased chance of a complete game, but you could just get some watered down lineups. Granted, when you're talking about Toronto and Boston, the watered down lineups are still usually pretty competent lineups, but still pretty likely to be worse than they normally are. And both of these pitchers are good. Jose Barrios has been solid this year. He's struck out. Where'd he go? So he struck out 25.8% of hitters, about 1 home run per 9, 3.62 xFIP, and he's not really expensive at 8,800. On the other side, Tanner Houck has good stuff. He's had plenty of success in his limited time with the Red Sox so far, with a 33.8% strikeout percentage, 2.34 xFIP. Again, not a ton of time in the majors yet, but so far his stuff has played up. He has looked good. He's coming off of, I believe it was his last start where he was just dominant. Went 4 innings. Yeah. 4 innings in his last start, actually, against Toronto, struck out 7, was pulled at 75 pitches. Prior to that, he had gone 4 2/3 against the Yankees through 87 pitches, struck out 8 in that start. So the competition's been tough for him, and he's still held his own and had success at only $7,200. The risk you're taking on top of the Blue Jays bats is that, again, we saw him pulled at 75 pitches despite pitching really well last start. He had thrown 87 the one before that, but it's obviously going to be difficult to guess exactly what the Red Sox do with him pitch count wise, but he does have massive strikeout upside. He is 7,200. I think that as long as the ownership is relatively low, and right now we do not have him in the top pitchers tool, so I don't know where we have the ownership projected, but assuming the ownership's relatively low, I do like him in tournaments.
Yeah, especially if we're going to have to see what those lineups look like. And sometimes there's really wonky doubleheader slates where the game locks and we don't even know who the players are that are in the lineups ahead of time, which are kind of my least favorite slates that happen. That's also why I wish that DK would also just exclude the doubleheader games like the FanDuel does. But I think that relative to the pitchers on the slate, I don't love either of them, but I think they're both worth a shot in large field GPPs. Next game on the slate, this is another one I'm kind of curious about the ownership about. Cincinnati Reds at home against Pittsburgh Pirates. The Reds offense has been absolutely just mashing lately. We have them with the second best odds, be the top scoring team of the slate. Yet we have the Pittsburgh Pirates on DK picking up more ownership than the Reds, and by a pretty significant margin. And it's not like this is a bad matchup for the Reds either. Mitch Keller's on the mound for Pittsburgh, and he's been terrible so far in his big league career. So why do you think it is that the Pirates are projected for double the ownership that the Reds currently are?
They're just crazy inexpensive compared to the Reds. And it's a good matchup. I mean, it's a park upgrade for Pittsburgh. Vladimir Gutierrez has not been good whatsoever this season. 1.73 home runs per nine, 15.8% strikeout percentage, 10.3% walk percentage. His 5.5% K minus BB percentage is worse than every single pitcher pitching today, with the exception of Josiah Gray, who I think has made like 2 or 3 major league appearances. So just great spot for Pittsburgh. Really cheap prices. Like, you're probably going to get Hoy Park leading off at 2,300. Colin Moran expected to be in the lineup at 3,400. Polanco's 2,700. And then, Brian Reynolds at 4,300 is still a reasonable price. Same for Brian Hayes at 4,400. So I think it's just going to be a lot easier to get to this team. Whereas, like, you look at the Reds, 3 of the top 5 hitters in their projected lineup are $6,100 or more. Jonathan India's $5K. It's really, really, really tough to stack them without taking some risks elsewhere. So I think that's why you're going to get a lot more ownership going to Pittsburgh. I think it's a really good spot for them. But at the same time, just as a general rule across a baseball season, I think if I refrain from rostering the Pirates when they're projected for twice as much ownership as they should get, I'm going to make more money than if I decide that that's a great spot to be.
Yeah, and there are a couple of cheaper hitters in the Reds lineup, ones that do stand out to me, at least to make stacks work. Nick Castellanos, there's already ownership going to him, but 4,200 for him on DK, that's a little bit too cheap. And then you go down to the bottom of the order. Tucker Barnhart, I think, is a fine catcher play. He's cheap and not picking up that much ownership. Tyler Naquin is also cheap, only picking up 3% ownership. So there are some individual hitters in the Reds lineup that I do think make sense from a salary perspective, and the ownership is also right for me to want to get to them. But are the Reds a team that you think you're going to be looking to stack overweight to the field today?
Yeah, I would definitely like to. Again, it's going to be difficult to get to them. And right now, I will say, like, with the way things look, I probably just get more Tampa. That's kind of what happened last night, where I liked the Reds. I thought everything looked good to get to them. But then because Tampa also looked so good, I just ended up getting massive amounts of Tampa and not quite as much Cincy as I thought I would. But, I do like the spot for the Reds. Mitch Keller is someone that I really, really want to be good. Like, I think he should be. I really wish he was on a team other than the Pirates, because we know what they do with their pitching prospects. I think he has good stuff. He's just never managed to put it together. And then now you've gotten a drop off in strikeout percentage as well. In 52 and a third innings this year, only a 21.1% strikeout percentage. Whereas at least, like, if you go back to 2019, where he was a really volatile pitcher, but he threw 48 innings with the Pirates, he struck out 28 or so percent of 28.6% of hitters. So, like, back then with Keller, it was always just like, okay, well, if he's going to be low owned, I'll take my chances because he's going to strike out a lot of guys. You're not even getting that this year. So, he's still walking too many guys at 11.6%. He's allowed 1.2 home runs per 9. It's a really, really tough park to pitch in. The Reds have a lot of good hitters. They also have Moustakas back in the lineup now. The strikeout percentage for Keller this year is even lower against lefties at 17.2%. That's a concern when you're talking about Winker, Votto, Moustakas being in the top 5. Really, really dangerous spot for Keller, and I think a really high upside spot for the Reds if you can get to them.
This is going to do no help for today's slate, but I'm going to give out a pick for like 2.5 years from now. There's going to be a point where the Pirates give up on Mitch Keller. He's going to go to another team and become good. That's my prediction. So roster Mitch Keller, not today, but like 2.5 years from now, he's going to be a viable DFS play. So
yeah, treat him like Kevin Gossman. It started rostering him when he went to the Braves, still didn't really work out, but now you can roster him with the Giants.
Yeah, put that in your back pocket. Mitch Keller in when EMAC runs for president in 2024. that's when you want to be rostering Mitch Keller also. Next game we have here on the slate, Brandon Woodruff against another guy who was once a talented young pitcher, but has really struggled with injuries and just not been able to stay on the field. Aaron Sanchez on the mound for San Francisco, but his last couple of outings, 2 innings, 3 innings, this is working back from injury. Before then, he hadn't pitched since May. So I can't really expect much from Aaron Sanchez. Also, I don't even know what to expect from results from him because he spent so much time off the field this year and dealing with injuries. So the Milwaukee Brewers, I'm kind of looking at them from an ownership standpoint. If they're going to be low owned by the time we get to lock, I think there's so much uncertainty with Aaron Sanchez. And it does look like the Brewers are not going to pick up much ownership. We're only projecting them for 0.8% right now on DK. Over on FanDuel, we're projecting them for 0.7% ownership. If these kind of numbers hold, I have interest in the Brewers just because I have no clue what we're getting from Aaron Sanchez going forward.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with that because there is just a lot of uncertainty. There's a really wide range of outcomes. The thing that will make it difficult is, again, if you have Tampa Bay and Cincinnati, both getting like half of the ownership that they deserve, it's going to be really hard for me to be getting to much of a team like Milwaukee that, I think in theory is a good play because of the uncertainty and they're not getting any ownership. But it's just like, I'm going to end up just playing so many Tampa Bay and Cincinnati stacks that it's going to naturally just knock down how much Milwaukee I can get to. But, if we assume that maybe ownership does come up somewhat on Tampa Bay and Cincinnati between now and lock, I do like in general targeting teams like Milwaukee that aren't getting ownership and are facing a pitcher in Sanchez that at times has been a good pitcher, but even for the most part during those stretches where he was good, he was still inconsistent and, was really difficult to rely on and would give up some big games. And then now you get this version where we really have no idea what to expect. So if the Reds and the Rays end up not being quite as under-owned as they're projected to be right now, I do like the idea of getting to the Brewers.
And then on the other side is going to be Brandon Woodruff on the mound from Milwaukee. Now, one thing I'm also going to say about this slate, one of the reasons the pay-up offenses are picking up so little ownership relative to their top stack odds is because we have so many talented pitchers to pay up for today. Brandon Woodruff, Julio Urias, Yu Darvish, Charlie Morton, Luis Garcia. Those are guys that are all picking up substantial ownership. And that's almost where all of the ownership of the field is going to a pitcher today. So that's the reason why pay-up offenses are not really getting any love from the public right now. My inclination is kind of to maybe mix it up a little bit, go cheap as an SP2 on DK, and then pay up for SP1 and then pay up for offense. But Brandon Woodruff, as far as pitchers go, I think he's the best overall pitcher on the slate, especially with some of the struggles we've seen recently from Yu Darvish. But I think I'm going to be a little bit underweight to the field on him just based on him trying to pay up for offenses, and he's projected to be nearly 50% of the field's lineups.
Yeah, and it's a pretty brutal matchup for him, too. I mean, you get Yu Darvish facing Arizona, whereas you get Brandon Woodruff facing the Giants, where the Giants are also getting a park upgrade. I understand that Brandon Woodruff's a very, very good pitcher, but I don't think he's as good as Corbin Burns. And so I'm not going to make the same. Like last night, I played more Burns than Bassett, which didn't really work out. But, whatever it was, there was still at least, like a huge difference in strikeout percentage there. And it was kind of just, I think that as good as Bassett is, Burns is just better. Woodruff is more of he's a number one, but he's not like off the charts compared to every other pitcher like Corbin Burns is. For example, his strikeout percentage is only 1 point higher than Yu Darvish's. He doesn't have the same home run issues that Darvish does, and he has been better, but it's just a lot more it's a lot more similar upside and range of outcomes, I think, with Woodruff here. And so I care a little bit more about the fact that he is facing a very, very good Giants offense that is getting a park upgrade, just got Brandon Belt back, has Bryant, Yastrzemski's healthy again. Really, really, really tough matchup for Woodruff, and he's getting a ton of ownership.
Yeah, and once again, it's not to say he's a poor play by any means. It's just some of the ways I'm going to be prioritizing my lineups. There's a lot of pitchers to pay up for. He's over 40% owned on DK. He's also pretty popular on FanDuel and expensive. So going to be in my player pool, just probably like 25 or 30%, which is a little less than the 40% the field has. Next game here. Oh yeah, go ahead. Oh,
I was going to say, it's just like, it's kind of like funny when you look at who the most expensive pitchers are facing. You have Woodruff against the Giants, and then it's just Urias against the Angels, which is, whatever, but they're, Ohtani's probably not going to be in the lineup. So pretty bad lineup there. Darvish against the Diamondbacks, Morton against the Nats AAA team, Luis Garcia against kind of close to Minnesota's AAA team. So it's just like of the 5 guys that you can pay up for that are really, really good, 4 of them are just like facing teams that basically are gutted. And then one of them is facing one of the best offenses in baseball.
Yeah, it's once again, this is a slate where I feel like a lot of opportunity cost has to be considered, where it's like, hey, we've got a lot of good pitchers. We also got good offenses. And generally, I just kind of want to do something a little different than what the field's doing, especially for baseball. And everybody's paying up for pitching today. Nobody's paying up for offense. But one spot where people are saving money at pitching is in this next game. Tyler Alexander on the mound against Eli Morgan. So Eli Morgan's going to be on the mound for Cleveland against Detroit. And he is picking up not a massive amount of ownership, but 14% on DK. If you look at his numbers this year, pretty solid strikeout stuff. The results haven't really been there. 6.75 ERA, 4.94 expected ERA. But anytime you have a pitcher who's cheap with a 26% K rate in a relatively favorable matchup, it's hard for me to not prioritize Eli Morgan on the cheaper range of pitchers, especially when there aren't that many cheap pitchers I feel good about.
This guy makes no sense to me. I don't understand why he's pitching well. He throws 90 miles an hour. In 5 starts at AAA this year, he struck out 22.8% of hitters, and he walked 12%. Now he's in the majors. His strikeout percentage has jumped 4 points, and his walk percentage has dropped by like 8. I don't get it. I don't get why he's good. He has had home run issues massively so far in the majors. it's a good matchup against the Tigers. I know that the numbers have been good for him, and he's made enough starts now where, you know, you have to at least to some extent buy into him getting strikeouts. It really does scare me rostering this guy at 14% ownership though, because I don't understand how this guy is good. He's got a really good changeup. You know, that does sort of mitigate the fact that he throws 90 miles an hour, but this is still one of those guys that it's just like, if he actually ends up being a good pitcher with the stuff that he has, he's just such an anomaly. It's kind of like Kyle Hendricks, you know, for every Kyle Hendricks that ends up being good for 5 years, there's like 15 of them that come up and have a pretty good stretch and then are just out of baseball pretty quickly because they throw 90 miles an hour and they're not good. So I still have so much trouble buying into Eli Morgan, even though he's had success so far. That being said, you know, I do get the value on the slate. He's only $7,400. He's facing the Tigers. We just saw Cal Quantrill win the slate last night because the Tigers suck despite what they did for a month. You know, they can certainly make any pitcher look good. I'm not saying I think Morgan is bad tonight. It's just, it's scary to me to roster this guy with ownership because I still just don't believe in him.
Yeah. And I mean, there's so many things that are weird about him. He has a 26.1% strikeout rate, 3.7% walk rate. That's all exceptional, but he still somehow managed to get a 6.75 ERA just because of his home run issue. So this guy's a super weird pitcher who's producing weird results this year. But for tournament purposes, if I'm looking to build lineups where I'm paying up for offense, I have to save money at pitcher somewhere. And Eli Morgan is probably going to be one of those guys that works his way into the mix for me. But on the other side is going to be Tyler Alexander on the mound against this Cleveland offense. Bad pitcher, bad offense. So what do you make of the matchup?
Someone's got to win out. I don't feel great about either side. I do prefer the Indian side just because I assume that Ramirez and Reyes will both be in the lineup, which we haven't seen in a couple of games, but it makes the ceiling higher there. And then you get a really cheap Miles Straw at the top. Ahmed Rosario is reasonable. Harold Ramirez probably batting fifth. Oscar Mercado is probably in there at a cheap price tag. So I give the edge to the Indians. They do have an implied run total over 5. They also are picking up ownership, as you would expect. You saw them getting ownership last night, basically for the same reason. They had 5.2 implied run total. They were facing a pretty poor pitcher in Matt Manning, and it's just easy to get them in the lineups. It's kind of just like with Texas on the early slate, except an even better spot than against Cole Irving. So they'll get ownership. I'll probably end up being underweight, but it's also going to be difficult to make any sort of a case for Tyler Alexander, who has an 18% strikeout percentage against righties, 20% against lefties, 249 expected ISO to righties, which is basically what he's going to be facing today. Really tough to make any case for him as well.
All right. The next game we have here is the Houston Astros against the Minnesota Twins. Now, Michael Pineda has been somebody who I've been looking to pick on quite a bit this year. And there's some really weird stuff going on with the Houston Astros today. For starters, just a lot of these batters are not priced appropriately. Kyle Tucker, Yordan Alvarez, Michael Brantley, Carlos Correa. I don't understand why the Houston Astros are so cheap today. As a result, a lot of these guys are pretty popular. As a stack, they're picking up less ownership than they should, except it's because the guys at the end of the lineup, Chas McCormick, Taylor Jones, Martin Maldonado, none of these guys are picking up any ownership, but all the guys that we actually care about are pretty popular. So what are you doing with the Houston Astros here?
Probably staying away and just praying that Pineda does a decent job. Right now, we have Houston projected for the highest aggregate ownership on DraftKings at 14.2%, only a 6.6% chance of being the top stack. I don't know what's going on with the pricing. Like the pricing on the Astros is just broke for whatever reason. Their salaries in some cases have actually come down, and they've been one of the most popular teams recently anyway. Carlos Correa from 4,100 to 3,900. Alvarez dropped $100. Brantley held at 3K. Kyle Tucker is 3,700, which is an absolute joke. And then the bottom of the order, like Aledmus Diaz, he's not great, but he shouldn't be $2,700 batting sixth in this lineup. Chas McCormick shouldn't be $2,200. Like nobody in this lineup should be that cheap. And so they are in a good spot. They have a 5.5 implied run total. Pineda, like you said, has had plenty of issues this year, but I just, again, it goes back to you're trying to win over the course of a season. And whenever a team shows up like this in terms of ownership, I just end up going somewhere else.
Yeah, it's a lot of ownership going to this team. And like I said, if you do want to differentiate the stack, there are lesser owned players at the bottom of the lineup, but they're not guys I really want to roster all that much. Like I'm not dying to roster Chas McCormick, Taylor Jones, or Martin Maldonado. So to me, yeah, if you look at our top stacks tool, which is free today over on Awesemo.com, you can check that out and see that the Astros on DK do like they're going pretty over-owned right now, about appropriately owned on FanDuel, but the pricing is also okay. And there's other spots I'd rather get to. So for me, the Houston Astros are a team that I'm going to have trouble prioritizing. And then on the other side of the game, I like Luis Garcia a lot as a pitcher, but you have to compare him to the other options on the slate where we have guys like Charlie Morton, Yu Darvish, Julio Urias, Brandon Woodruff. That and Luis Garcia is pretty expensive today. He's 10,300 on DK, which is a little odd considering how good some of these other pitchers are on the slate. 8,300 on FanDuel is a little more tenable. But at least it's as far as DK goes, I can't prioritize him over some of these other guys we have.
So one other thing I wanted to mention with Houston is that individually, like I still think you can get to these guys as one-offs. Like Alvarez is getting 14% ownership, Tucker's at 16. That's not crazy. It's just more so when you stack them all together, you're allocating a ton of ownership there. So I do still like those guys as one-offs. Going back to Garcia, I'm with you. He's overpriced, but I think the matchup's still pretty good against Minnesota. It's not as good as a couple of the others. The thing that jumps out though is that of the 5 really high upside pitchers, he's by far getting the least ownership right now at just shy of 8% on DraftKings. Even Julio Urias, who's $200 more, is at 21.5%. So I do think it's kind of an interesting idea to just pay up to be contrarian on him there. The range of outcomes is still similar enough. He doesn't throw quite as many pitches as these other guys at the top, which is an issue. You don't have the same track record of him being really, really good, but he does come into this game with a 29.3% strikeout percentage, 3.73 xFIP. I don't think he's as good as some of these other top end guys, but I do think that getting overweight on 7% is kind of an interesting spot, especially, again, like with Woodruff getting 41% ownership against the Giants. The way I see it is I kind of just want to move some of that ownership to like the other 4 that are in much better matchups.
Yeah, that's where I'm at too. And then no interest in stacking the Twins either against Garcia, but it's a slate where it's a pretty big slate and we just have to make cutoffs somewhere. And the price for Luis Garcia, like I said, FanDuel, totally reasonable to play him in the 8K range, but really expensive on DK, and I have to prioritize other guys. Next game here is the St. Louis Cardinals against the Kansas City Royals. Kwang Hung Kim on the mound for St. Louis, Brad Keller on the mound for KC. Kim has produced pretty good results this year, but I hardly ever play him for fantasy just because there's the lack of strikeout stuff. So with Kim on this particular slate, there's also a lot of good pitchers to get to. We have Kim on DK is priced at, why can I not find him? Oh, here he is, 8,500. And once again, the lack of strikeout upside, that's more than I could reasonably play for him.
Yeah, exactly. I think he's a decent pitcher. There's some slates where I'm willing to go there just because like he still gives you some good starts because he goes 6 or 7 innings and picks up points that way. He's had a couple of good strikeout starts recently, both against the Cubs where he struck out 7, but overall just doesn't give you that same strikeout upside that a lot of pitchers on this slate do. Only an 18.4% strikeout percentage, and he's kind of in no man's land in terms of salary because you basically can sacrifice like 1 or maybe 2 bats and get from Kim to an ace that has really good strikeout stuff, or you can add 1 or 2 bats and go from Kim to a risky $6,700 or $6,600 guy that still gives you at least a similar ceiling. So it's kind of just a really, really tough price point to get to for me, even though it is a pretty decent matchup against Kansas City.
Yeah, a lot of pitchers to consider. If we had Kim, there were slates a little bit earlier in the year where he was 6,600, 6,700. That was something where it was like, hey, he's not going to get strikeouts, but he limits runs. He could land himself in the optimal lineup like that. I don't really see it being a likely outcome at all at his current salary. And the other side, Brad Keller is going to be on the mound for the Royals, and Brad Keller's results this year, 5.64 ERA, 6.41 expected ERA. So he's been no good. The St. Louis Cardinals do appear to be in a pretty good spot, maybe going a little bit under-owned. So a team that for FanDuel purpose, at least going a little bit over-owned, and then on DK about appropriately owned. But still, this is a low priority offense. There's other teams that look more egregiously under-owned in our top stacks tool. I don't really have interest in the pitchers or the offenses on either side of this game.
Yeah, it's more so, I think, individual bats for me. From like a game theory perspective, I kind of like the idea of Brad Keller. I just hate that it's Brad Keller. Like he's 6,800 projected for 1% ownership right now. So he's in that same price range where like Austin Gomber, who we'll talk about in cores, is getting 17%. Eli Morgan's getting 14%. These are pitchers that have plenty of question marks on their own, and Keller certainly does as well. But the thing with Keller is not only is he just not good overall, even if you look at his splits, you can't really make any sort of case for why this would be a particularly good matchup for him. The Cardinals have a right-handed heavy lineup, which for most right-handed pitchers would be a good thing, but Keller has actually had more issues with righties this year. 14.9% strikeout percentage against righties compared to 22% against lefties, 206 expected ISO to righties. You still can certainly just say, okay, I'm going to take the 1% owned Keller over the 17% owned dude in cores, but there's nothing I can put behind that other than it's baseball, weird shit happens. Brad Keller will have a decent start here some percentage of the time. That's really the only argument I can make.
And speaking of it's baseball, weird shit happens. Josiah Gray is in this next game we have here. It is the Washington Nationals against the Atlanta Braves. Now, Josiah Gray is somebody who's a well-regarded prospect. He has really good stuff. We haven't really seen that much from at the big leagues, though. He's pitched a total of 13 innings this year at the major league level, 4.85 ERA, 5.71 expected ERA. He has produced a 26.8% K rate. So no reason to consider him on FanDuel on a single pitcher site. But on DK, where we're looking for SP2 options, any interest in rolling the dice with Josiah Gray just because he's a well-regarded prospect with good stuff that we don't know that much about?
A little bit, more of a 150 max play than a 20 max or a 3 max or anything like that. We have him with a 10% chance of being a top 2 pitcher, only getting 5% ownership. I think from an ownership standpoint, the pivot from Eli Morgan makes sense because basically you're saying, would I rather take a popular pitcher that I think probably sucks, but is in a good matchup, or a lower owned pitcher that I think is probably good, but has a really tough matchup and also has pitch count concerns because we haven't seen him go, even 80 pitches yet in the majors. I think that, that is certainly a spot you can roll. You can roll the dice and go to Gray. I don't think it's any sort of a necessity. I wouldn't expect to be getting, 20% Josiah Gray or anything like that. But I do think he's probably coming in a little bit under owned just relative to the other cheap pitchers because they all have question marks. In Gray's case, it's matchup and pitch count. In Morgan's case, it's what's his actual talent level. In Gomber's case, he's pitching in Coors Field. There's massive questions about anyone who isn't basically one of the top pitchers tonight.
Yeah, and then on the other side of the game, we do have one of the top pitchers on the slate, Charlie Morton, and Charlie Morton is going to be very popular today, projected for 30% ownership today on DK. He's also going to be a popular pitching option on FanDuel. It all makes sense to me. I think he should actually be a little bit more expensive today than he is, just considering the Washington Nationals offense is so much weakened versus what it was a couple of weeks ago after the trade deadline. So with that in mind, Charlie Morton, I think that I like the salary savings he offers. I like the matchup he's in. So he's going to be a pretty high priority pitching option for me, especially because of the little bit of savings he offers over the other top pitchers.
Yep, I agree. Just really good spot against Washington. I'm fine with picking on this team as much as I can. We don't know if Soto will be in the lineup. If he's out, then clearly the Washington lineup's even better for Morton. He's getting less ownership than Brandon Woodruff, which I get it because Woodruff has been the better pitcher as good as Morton's been. Woodruff has been better, but again, you're facing the Nats, this version of the Nats, or you're facing the best version of the Giants we've seen all year. It's just really tough for me, to pay an extra $500 and take on more ownership for Woodruff right now than to just, plug in Morton against the Nats and take whatever happens.
All right, 3 games left to talk about, but there's a lot more than just MLB DFS going on today. We also have the NASCAR Strategy Show, MMA Live Before Lock, and then MLB Live Before Lock later. So do us a favor, like this video, subscribe to the YouTube channel so you guys are aware we're talking about all of the other DFS sports that are going to be going on today. And then also, if you want access to data for all of these sports, you can sign up for an Awesemo Plus Platinum weekly package for $29.95. And if it's your first time signing up for Awesemo Plus, use the promo code MLB Strategy Show. That's all one word, all capital letters, MLB Strategy Show. They'll get you 25% off your first week of Awesemo Plus. And then also, if you're only looking to play MLB, if you're just here to watch us talk about MLB, you don't care about NASCAR later, don't care about MMA, sign up for an Awesemo Plus MLB weekly package for $15.95. Stop guessing, start winning, join Awesemo Plus today. All right, 3 games left, and now one of my least favorite games on the slate. It's Coors Field, Jesus Luzardo against Austin Gomber. Both these offenses suck. It is the Rockies, it is the Marlins. Jesus Luzardo, though, I kind of have interest in him as an SP2 option on DraftKings. The Rockies are still not a good offense. I understand they went off yesterday. It's Coors Field. Anything could happen. But Luzardo looked pretty decent in his first start with the Marlins against the Mets. Hopefully they're able to do better work with him than what happened when he kind of fell apart with the A's. And didn't really give up on him, but they moved him for Starling Marte. So any reason for you to want to join me and just cross our fingers and play Jesus Luzardo?
Yeah. There's a couple of them. So basically the argument when I was trying to come up with some reason to play Brad Keller and I was failing because Brad Keller there's nothing redeeming about him. Jesus Luzardo, at least, he has talent. He kind of fell off the face of the earth at AAA and with the A's this year, but looked pretty good in that first start with Miami, and the talent's still there. I think that he's more likely to bounce back than not, in my opinion. And he's cheap. He's fully stretched out. The Rockies are still a bad offense, like you said. They have hitters that can do some damage individually. Trevor Story is good. Rogers can hit mistakes. Crone can do damage, but overall, it's still a pretty bad offense. It's a terrible park to pitch in, obviously, but on top of Luzardo probably being the most talented in terms of just pitching of the sub 7 or 7,500 and below guys, you're also getting 13% aggregate ownership going to the Rockies. They're projected to be one of the most over-owned teams on this slate. They have one of the highest implied run totals because it scores, but just thinking in terms of range of outcomes, Luzardo can easily, I mean, I don't want to say easily as in like it's super likely to happen, but there's nothing preventing him from just going out there scoring, 18, 20 points in 6 innings, just having a good start. He's got good stuff. He should be a good pitcher. At 1% ownership, I don't see why, like, I understand why Austin Gomber is getting ownership, for example, at 6,600. I don't know why he's getting 18 times the ownership as Jesus Luzardo, because they're both facing bad offenses. They're both pitching in the same terrible park to pitch in. They're both, good, at least decent pitchers. I don't really know why one's getting drastically more ownership than the other.
Yeah, and we have even the Marlins offense, even though we have Gomber picking up a lot of ownership. I mean, there's also the Marlins are popular themselves also. We have the Marlins right now projected for 10.1% ownership on DK. So they're also pretty massively negatively leveraged. So I look at all the spots on this slate. Both the offense are going to be really popular. I want to be underweight to the offenses. The pitchers, Austin Gomber, whatever. We need SP2s to pay for. I don't mind getting to Gomber, but I'd rather get to Luzardo for just what I expect to be a somewhat similar median outcome and just much less ownership. So Gomber on the other side, what are you doing with him in tournaments? Because he is one of the more popular, cheaper pitching options.
So to answer my question, just, kind of talking out loud and saying, why is Gomber getting so much more ownership in the same spot? He is projected for 6 more fantasy points. So that would be why. That's a pretty big gap. But again, I just think Luzardo has a ceiling here that a lot of guys at the salary don't have. But I do like Gomber here. Miami is a weak offense. Gomber has been pretty solid this season. I've mentioned a few times recently that I do just always feel a little bit better if I have to take a pitcher in Coors Field, taking the one that makes his home starts there as opposed to the one who is coming in and isn't used to pitching there. Overall this season, Gomber has about a 24% strikeout percentage, 3.74 xFIP, 1.28 home runs per 9. And this Marlins lineup is just, pretty weak. So I think Gomber is a little bit underpriced. It scares me somewhat that he is getting ownership here, but I think I feel better about Gomber at 17% than I do about Morgan at 14%, even though Morgan is not pitching in Coors Field.
And then the offense in this game, I assume, like me, teams that probably more suited for one-offs and maybe a slight amount of stacking, but I'm going to be pretty heavily underweight to 5-man stacks.
Yep, that's where I expect to be as well. Obviously, you can just go to these guys once your lineup is contrarian, like you have a low on stack, you have low on pitching, whatever. Feel free to mix in Rockies and Marlins, whatever fits in your lineup. But that's kind of the approach I'll be taking with them, just like with Houston, because doing that allows me to get a low owned overall lineup. Whereas if you're plugging in 5 highly owned guys, you're just overlapping with so many teams. It makes it really, really difficult, even more difficult than normal to win a tournament.
All right, next game here, Yu Darvish going up against the Arizona Diamondbacks. So there's nothing from the Diamondbacks that's going to be of interest to us, nothing from the pitching side, nothing from a hitting side. But one thing about Yu Darvish that is a little concerning is just his recent results haven't been great. Last time out at home against the Rockies, pitched 6 innings, gave up 5 runs. The start before that against the Marlins, 5 innings, 4 runs. Before that against Atlanta, 5 2/3 innings, 2 runs. And start before that against the Nationals, 3 innings, 6 runs. So what do you make of this recent little bit of poor stretch from Yu Darvish, and will he be able to bounce back against one of the worst offenses in baseball?
Yeah, I mean, it's concerning because it came at least partly in good matchups. Like you said, Colorado in San Diego, Miami in Miami. Those are spots where Yu Darvish should just go out and dominate. And Darvish is a pitcher that in the past, he has dealt with some injury issues. He has dealt with stretches in his career where he could not throw strikes or he gave up tons of home runs. So it's kind of like, we were talking about Robbie Ray earlier. As soon as you start to see him kind of like turning back into this other guy, it's a little bit concerning. But there's not really much I can do with that, I don't think. Like, I still have to expect that Yu Darvish is going to be what he has been this year. And that's a pitcher that overall has been good. He has had home run issues, 1.41 home runs per 9, but the walk issues have been under control at 5.9%. 29% strikeout percentage is good. This is still a good matchup against the Diamondbacks. So I'm still going to get to Darvish, but again, he's getting 44% ownership on DraftKings right now. Yeah, it's a better matchup than Woodruff has, but I just keep looking at these guys like Urias, Morton, and Garcia and saying, I think given their matchups and or their ownership, they should just be a little bit more popular, and guys like Darvish and Woodruff should probably be a little bit lower.
Yeah, and then on the other side of this game, Taylor Widener is going to be on the mound for Arizona. Like I said, we're not going to have interest in Arizona as an offense. We're not going to have interest in Widener as a pitcher, but the Padres as a stack. Is this a team that you're gravitating to at all? This is a team that was massively popular for a really long time. The Padres might not even make the playoffs at this point now that Tatis isn't in the mix, because they've really struggled recently, especially with all the games the Reds are winning. It would not surprise me to see the Reds pass in the standings soon.
Yeah, there's nothing that really stands out to me here. Like, losing Tatis just makes the Padres so much more difficult to get to, because not only is he one of the best hitters in baseball, one of the highest upside guys, but he covers that shortstop position. So that's one reason that Padres stacks were so appealing. Now it's like, Machado is great, but it's not really that difficult to find third baseman. Eric Hosmer's batting cleanup. It's not difficult at all to find first baseman. Then you have a bunch of outfielders, which also aren't difficult to find. So there's not quite as much that stands out here. Their ownership is coming in about where it looks like it should be. I will point to Trent Grisham at 3,600. I think that is just a little bit cheaper price tag than you should probably get. Widener has had power issues to both sides of the plate in his limited time in the majors so far. 252 expected ISO to lefties, 205 to righties. So, any of these power hitting Padres that you get to individually, I think are fine. The guy that does stand out the most to me, though, again, is Trent Grisham at only 3,600.
All right, now we can bring it home. The final game on the slate, it is the Los Angeles Dodgers against the Los Angeles Angels. Julio Urias on the mound for the Dodgers, Jaime Barria for the Angels. So now starting with Urias, how does he stack up for you against all these other pay-up options we've talked about a pitcher today?
So he's kind of like Luis Garcia in that typically you're only getting around 90 pitches from him. And that's a little concerning when you compare him to, these other guys that can go a little bit deeper into games. But he's also just not getting as much ownership. We actually have him with the second highest top two pitcher percentage tonight, slightly ahead of Yu Darvish, behind Woodruff. But he's getting about half the ownership of Woodruff and Darvish. It's not a bad matchup here against the Angels. They lose the DH, which in their case means they lose basically the only good hitter in their lineup. Or at least the only really dangerous hitter in their lineup. So I think it is a good spot for Urias. I think as long as the ownership continues to be around half of Woodruff and Darvish, I'll definitely be interested there. You look at projections, and Urias is coming in just about the same as Darvish and Woodruff, like a 1 point difference between him and Woodruff, like a 10th of a point between him and Darvish using Awesemo's projections. So I really don't think the ownership should be that different. He's another guy that I think I get a little bit more of at the expense of Woodruff and Darvish.
All right. And then on the other side, Jaime Barria is going to be pitching against the Dodgers. The Dodgers are fairly popular on FanDuel, project for 10.8% ownership as a team. On DK, only project for 3.8% ownership. This is just a pricing thing. They're a little bit underpriced on, they're so overpriced on DK that people aren't getting some. FanDuel. They're just about appropriately priced, so people are willing to rush them there. I don't have an issue with the Dodgers on DK. FanDuel, I think they're overowned. For DK, here's the one problem, though. It's not about the Dodgers themselves. It's just if I'm paying up for a contrarian offense, I'd rather it be the Rays or the Reds. Yeah,
that's where I'm at. The Dodgers do look good. So I think it wouldn't take a big increase in ownership for Tampa Bay or Cincinnati for the Dodgers to look a little bit better. And they are getting, just less ownership across, compared to those teams. Tampa Bay and Cincinnati are both in better spots, but they are getting more ownership from the Dodgers. So I think right now I would say the Dodgers are probably my third favorite stack. It's just that Tampa Bay and Cincy both do look quite a bit more appealing. You also have the issue with the Dodgers of Mookie Betts leaving last night's game early. So one, you may not have a lineup before lock, but two, you may not have Mookie Betts in it. And clearly if you're stacking the Dodgers, you would prefer to have Mookie Betts playing, even though it's a really deep lineup one way or the other. Trey Turner, I think, is expected back. So that does add even more upside here. It does also add another really expensive bat. Jaime Barria for his career has been okay. But still just, I'll give the edge to the Dodgers before, in a spot here against Barria. All right, that will do it for us. But guys, that is not the only DFS content coming up on the channel today. We've got MMA content, more MLB content, MLB Live before lock later tonight. There's the NASCAR Strategy Show. We're covering everything here. So subscribe to the channel, like the video, and good luck today.